I know this is going to come as a grave disappointment to you, but I'm not going to be showing any slides. First, let me thank Dr. Borenstein. Jeff, as you all know, is a terrific leader for this foundation. He knows his science, he knows his community. The only thing he really doesn't know is how to spell his last name. It's 2 O's, 1 N, and no E's, Jeff. Let's remember that. I also want to thank the Foundation's Board of Directors, the Scientific Council, and the staff. Symposia like this don't come together from spontaneous generation, so I'd like to have a round of applause for the staff that put this together. Also like to thank the Symposia sponsors. I hope I pronounced these correctly, Otsuka and Synovian. And before I go on, let me congratulate the real people who make this happen. That is the prize winners, the young investigators that you're honoring. I don't think it would be right standing here today, the first time this conference has taken place since the passing of Connie Lieber, if I didn't pause for a second, at least pay tribute to her. My interactions with Connie over the years, mostly by phone, but occasionally in person, well, they began with arguments over whether the name NARSAD was a really bad acronym or just plain awful. But fundamentally, my interactions with Connie were full of hope. She, to me anyway, in this field, defined the notion of inspiration. She drove researchers of all ages to find clues to the diseases that people like me suffer from. And she urged me and others to speak out about our illnesses. I was thinking about Connie, and I decided that she combined the brains and commitment of Golda Meir, the charm of Lauren Bacall, and the persuasive powers of John Gotti. Without the firearms, of course. So all of us owe Connie and her family an enormous debt of gratitude. My talk today is called A Search for Balance, Personal and Political Reflections on Mental Health. Now, I don't want to be immodest, but I think I'm pretty well qualified to speak on both of these things. First, mental health is a personal subject for me. As Dr. Borenstein said, I have bipolar disorder, manic depression, whatever you like to call it. I know that people disagree. Since 1987, when I had my first psychotic episode and was hospitalized across town at Payne Whitney, I don't know if there are other Payne Whitney alums in the room, I've had more than my share of firsthand encounters with mental illness. As it involves politics, well, there I've also been involved with it for a long time. Since 1972, in fact, when I first rode my bicycle for a senator from South Dakota by the name of George McGovern. Yes, I am that old. In the decade since, I've worked on 4 presidential campaigns here in the United States and a bunch for heads of state overseas, and I spent 7 years in a US administration. Having experienced these campaigns and gotten to know a bunch of politicians over the years, when this year's campaign began, what seems like a decade ago to me, I honestly thought I had seen everything in politics. Not even close. 2016 has given us a vibrant reminder, if we really needed another, that if there ever was a group of people and a place in need of psychiatric services and some serious medication, those people would be politicians, and that place would be Washington, D.C. Now, the good news, the very, very good news, is that this campaign will be over in 11 days. That's okay, you can applaud. The bad news, in my estimation, is that we, an entire nation, will be left needing treatment for PTSD. I'm going to segue now. See, speechwriter thing, I'm going to segue now. Using an old speechwriter's trick, I'm going to compliment the audience. It's meant to soften you up and make you feel all warm and fuzzy about me. But in this case, what I have to say, as Henry Kissinger once said in a radically different context, what I'm going to say has the added advantage of being true. In this room, there are people who decipher the genetic code, who analyze the intricacies of neurotransmitters, who start the process that leads to medications that, while imperfect, actually work, who donate money, large sums of money, so that scientists can search for solutions, who care for people who are in search of better mental health, and who actually have these illnesses. So let me say to those of you here today, and to the tens of thousands of people you represent who are not in this auditorium, a simple and completely inadequate thank you. Without you, I wouldn't be standing here today. That much I can say for sure. Your commitment and your efforts have made it possible for me to wake up in the morning and go to work, to stay out of the mental hospital now for 28 years, to survive various tragedies, to not kill myself, to get married and raise children, albeit with mixed success, to make it through a particularly ugly divorce, and then to get a second chance and find a fabulous woman who was foolish enough to want to share her life with me. So a big thank you to the group in this hall for, well, my life. If nothing else, you should leave this meeting feeling really good about what you've done for me. So we're all here today because for one reason or another, we have a deep fascination with the brain. How it works, of course, but perhaps more important, what happens when it doesn't. In my case, unlike many of you, that fascination comes involuntarily. More than half a life ago, when I was 27, after several years of psychoanalysis and severe depression, and please don't ask me which caused which, I was diagnosed with manic depression. I had a couple of wildly psychotic episodes that led to stays in 2 mental hospitals. I sued an insurance company over its failure to adequately cover my mental illness. I got deeply involved in mental health advocacy. I ran support groups for patients and their families here in New York City. We did not want for participants, as you can imagine. And I had the special pleasure, I would say, of working on the wildly successful Clinton healthcare reform effort. I am also here because of family. I'm the grandchild son of and nephew of people marked by mental illness of one sort or another. I've got a sister with depression, and I am the father of a child, an uncle, and cousin to others who are on the autism spectrum. Thinking about the mess that is my family, I am reminded of a bumper sticker I once saw. "You there," it commanded, "get out of the gene pool." That's a true story. On a far more serious note, I'm here because I'm lucky. In addition to benefiting from all your work, I come from a personal background where psychiatric treatment is not only understood but also encouraged, where finding money for treatment has not been a problem, where my family and friends have stuck by me. In fact, my mother is in the back of the auditorium today. Thanks, Mom. And also a background where I've been able, virtually since the day after my diagnosis, to be open about my illness at work. I like to ascribe that to the fact that I've worked for Democrats all along. Now, those kinds of things can't be said for millions of people who have illnesses that affect the brain. So I guess when it comes down to it, I'm here to speak for them, to stand in for many, many other people and urge you to continue your work, whether that's as a bench scientist, a donor, a caregiver, or someone who speaks openly about his or her illness. Now, since I first opened my big mouth about 30 years ago and started talking about what it's like to have a severe mental illness, I've often been asked a stupid question. Why? Why would you be so stupid as to talk about something that personal, that embarrassing, that potentially career-destroying? Well, the simplest way I can explain it is this. When something really bad happens to you, you have three choices: denial, pity, or action. Denial is something that just doesn't come very naturally to me. I see it as both fundamentally weak. Yes, I know that's not a politically correct thing to say, and useless. Pity, self-pity, I tried that one. Unlike denial, pity came fairly naturally to me. All of the Jews and Catholics in the audience will know why. After my release following my second bout of psychosis, I sat in a chair in my shrink's office and told him my tale of woe, that there was little I could do to change my life. Smart guy that he is, he disagreed. And when I started talking about how the fix was in, now there's nothing you can do about your genetics, he didn't promise the moon, he didn't say foolish things, he simply said, yes, it will take a lot of adjustment, but you can never give up. And pretty soon after that, I turned to action. Why? I turned to action first because I was angry. What was I angry about? I was angry, frankly, at the way that health insurance in this country works. You see, when I had my second episode and I was strapped to a gurney in the halls of Massachusetts General Hospital, stark raving mad, my shrink came running from the suburbs of Boston and told them to transfer me to McLean Hospital. McLean Hospital, the Ritz-Carlton of all mental hospitals. But McLean turned down the transfer because when they called the New York Life Insurance Company, my health insurer, said he's hit his lifetime limit for coverage of mental illness. So eventually, they ended up calling my brother, and he guaranteed $18,000 on his American Express card in order to get me admitted into the hospital. $18,000, a lot of money. Once the antipsychotics took effect and I found out what had happened, well, that gave me a pretty good reason to get active. And I would note that, by the way, under Obamacare, what happened to me can't happen anymore. Lifetime limits do not exist. I also want to thank Dr. Schatzberg, who's in the audience today. At that point, he was running the bipolar unit at McLean, and they did a fine job repairing me, so thank you. Second, I chose action because I reasoned if people like me, and by that I mean people with all the advantages in the world, didn't speak out, who would? And this was back in the days before it was chic to talk about depression. Third, I chose action because I was always pretty good at talking. The first thing I learned when I started to talk, however, was how to listen. And I discovered that there were a lot of people who were desperate to be heard. And over the years since then, I've done my level best to listen keep listening, to offer some advice, and provide some measure of hope simply by showing up and staying alive. And today, I can honestly say that of all the crazy and wonderful things I've done in my life, working for Google, reading Anna Karenina, camping out in the Sahara Desert, seeing my stepdaughter reveal her lobster tattoo for the first time, and flying around the world on Air Force One, helping the president decide what he was going to say next. Of all those things, I can honestly say the most fulfilling moments in my life have come when I have helped people like me who have mental illness. A few months back, I went to Philadelphia for the Democratic National Convention. It was my 10th political convention, including, for the record, one Republican. And I took Katrine is my love, so we could witness history in the making. But it turned out for me to be more family reunion than political convention. Friends, media, politics, government, technology, pieces of my life, all in one humid, soggy mess. And at one of the many receptions we attended, I met a woman who I had worked with more than 20 years earlier at the Treasury Department. She came up to me, reintroduced herself, and she recalled a conversation we had had about depression. I didn't remember it. But she looked me in the eye and she said, "That conversation changed my life." And then an old office mate of mine from Google wandered over and told me that encouraging him to see a shrink had helped him get on meds, push back his depression, and brought a measure of stability and happiness into his life. Everyone else left Philly thinking about what job they wanted in the Clinton administration. I left thinking about those two people and thinking about how we can all change a life or two by listening, through acceptance, and by action. I'm going to close with a brief comment about politics. Brief, not only because I know we're tired of it, but also because, like any good campaign, my message is short and simple. It's time that we lift the cause of mental health above politics. This should be a personal cause for everyone because, in one way or another, and whether we know it or not, we are all touched by mental health. So let's tell the stories. Let's go out there and tell them. Let's tell the stories of the military and the veterans whose experiences in war have left them marked by trauma and traumatic brain injury. Let's talk more, a lot more, about PTSD and suicide in the military. And let's translate that into more money for psychiatrists, psychologists, social workers, and psychiatric nurses to care for those who fight our wars. Let's tell the stories, one by one, if need be, of the tens of thousands of people with severe mental illness who occupy our nation's prisons. At a time when people say the two parties can't agree on anything, the far right, and by that I mean the really far right, the Koch brothers, and the far left, and by that I mean the Center for American Progress, the lefty think tank I used to work for, those two parties have come together to find common ground on criminal justice reform. Change is not out of our reach. Let's tell the stories of people with severe mental illness who can't afford to pay the price of the drugs that keep them out of the hospital, the drugs that people in this room helped to develop. Let's use individual examples to show people who make decisions in Washington how treating people with those meds and with psychotherapy is going to save lives and also save a lot of money in the long run. And for God's sake, let's keep telling the story of the children of Newtown and the innocents in a score of American schools and malls and street corners who have lost their lives because in this country of ours, in the 21st century, it is easier to get hold of an automatic weapon than it is to get treatment for mental health. Now, look, I'm no naif. After being as long as I've been in Washington, you can't be. I know all too well that lifting mental health out of politics, notice the repetition of the message, will not be easy. But in the last year alone, we've seen some pretty weird stuff come down the pike. 2016 seems to have set a new standard for the can you believe it factor. After all, this was the year when Britain decided it was not part of Europe, when Vladimir Putin hacked the Democratic Party's computers, when the Chinese and the Americans signed an agreement to control climate change, and when, miracle of miracles, the Cubs made it to the World Series. Here in America, in our presidential race, we've seen one nominee, I won't mention her name, who, for the first time in history, has laid out an entire blueprint for mental health policy in the next administration. And we've seen another nominee who simply by opening his mouth every day raises critical questions about mental health. The good news is that, as I said at the beginning, our long national nightmare is almost over, and 2017 does not have to be like 2016. Really, it can be a year when we find the kind of balance in our political life that those of us with mental illness try to find every day in our personal lives. If we can find that balance, if we can listen, if we can give voice and hope to those who are now ignored, if we can give life to Connie Lieber's original vision for this organization, if we can take action, then progress will be within our reach. And I think that's a story that would be worth telling. Thank you very much.